The lights in the debate hall were clinical, bright, and unforgiving, designed not to flatter but to expose, and as the moderator welcomed the candidates, the air felt thick with anticipation, not because of the policies to be discussed, but because of the personalities about to collide, and Zohran Mamdani, seated at the far left of the stage, adjusted his mic with the quiet precision of someone who knew that presence was more powerful than performance, and across from him sat Andrew Cuomo, former governor, seasoned debater, a man whose voice had filled press rooms and dominated headlines for years, and between them sat Curtis Sliwa, animated, theatrical, but tonight, even he seemed to sense that the real tension was between the past and the future, and as the moderator asked the first question, about housing equity and urban renewal, Mamdani leaned forward, ready to speak, and then it happened, the moment that would define the night, the moment that would ripple across social media and political classrooms for weeks to come. Cuomo interrupted, not with a question, but with a dismissal. "Let's be real, that's not how the city works," and Mamdani paused, not because he was caught off guard, but because he understood that interruption is not just a tactic, it's a signal, and the audience shifted, some leaning forward, some pulling back, sensing the shift in energy, and Mamdani resumed, calmly. "As I was saying," but Cuomo cut in again, "you've never run a city, Zohran." And the moderator tried to intervene, but Mamdani raised a hand gently, signaling that he would not be rushed, and the third interruption came, sharper this time. "You're speaking in theory. I've lived the reality," and Mamdani nodded, slowly, absorbing the jab like a boxer who knows the real fight hasn't begun, and he said nothing. Not yet, because silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it's preparation. And the fourth interruption came before Mamdani could complete his sentence, and the fifth followed seconds later, and each time, Mamdani didn't retaliate. He recalibrated, letting the audience feel the imbalance, letting the contrast build, and then, with a calm that felt almost defiant, Mamdani leaned into the mic and said, "I'll speak when silence is no longer safe," and the room froze, because the line wasn't just poetic, it was principled, and Cuomo smirked. "So you think I'm unsafe?" And Mamdani replied, "I think interruption is the language of fear," and the audience murmured. Because suddenly the debate wasn't about policy, it was about posture, about presence, about the ethics of how we speak when the stakes are high, and Mamdani leaned back, letting the silence do its work, letting the audience sit with the discomfort of what had just happened, and the moderator, now visibly unsettled, turned to Cuomo. "Let's allow Mr. Mamdani to finish." And Cuomo shrugged, but said nothing, and Mamdani resumed, not with anger, but with clarity. "Leadership isn't volume, it's vision." And the line landed like a stone in still water, and the audience, now fully engaged, began to see the contrast not as conflict but as character, and Mamdani continued, "I was taught that when you're interrupted, you don't raise your voice, you raise your standard," and the room leaned in, not because they agreed with him, but because they respected him, and in that moment, the debate shifted, not because Mamdani won a point, but because he refused to play the game, and the cameras zoomed. The tweets began, and the phrase, "silence is no longer safe," began to trend, and Mamdani, still seated, still composed, had done something rare. He had turned interruption into invitation, and the night was only beginning. The interruptions didn't stop after the first round. They multiplied, like echoes bouncing off marble walls, and as the moderator moved to the next question, this time about public safety and policing, Mamdani began with a measured tone. Safety is not just the absence of crime, it's the presence of dignity. But before he could complete the thought, Cuomo leaned in again. "That's a nice slogan, but it's not policy." And Mamdani paused, not because he lacked a response, but because he understood. That interruption is not just noise, it's narrative, and the audience, now attuned to the rhythm of the exchange, began to notice the pattern, and the second interruption came. "You don't understand how NYPD works," and Mamdani, still composed, said, "I understand how communities feel when they're overpoliced and underprotected," and the third interruption followed. "That's not the same thing," and Mamdani nodded. "It's not, but it's what they live." And the fourth interruption came, sharper. "You're romanticizing activism," and Mamdani replied, "I'm humanizing governance." And the fifth interruption landed like a slap. "You're not ready for this job." And Mamdani, without flinching, said, "Readiness is not measured by volume, it's measured by values." And the room shifted again, because the contrast was no longer just stylistic, it was philosophical. And Mamdani's restraint began to feel like resistance, like a quiet rebellion against the politics of dominance, and the moderator, now visibly uncomfortable, said, "Let's allow each candidate to finish their thoughts." And Cuomo leaned back, arms crossed, but his eyes still sharp, and Mamdani continued, "I was raised in a home where silence was survival, where speaking out came with consequences." And he told of his father, a taxi driver who once spent a night in jail for refusing to pay a bribe, and how that moment taught him that dignity is not given, it's claimed. And he said, "Every time I'm interrupted, I remember that night, and I choose not to waste my voice on volume." And the audience leaned in, because this wasn't just a debate, it was a reckoning. And Mamdani added, "We've mistaken aggression for authority." And the line landed, not with applause, but with reflection. And Cuomo, now quieter, said, "You think you're better than experience?" And Mamdani replied, "I think experience without empathy is just repetition." And the moderator, sensing the shift, asked Mamdani to elaborate, and he did, not with statistics, but with stories of mothers afraid to call 911, of teenagers stopped for walking home, of elders who lock their doors not out of fear of crime, but fear of misunderstanding. And he said, "Safety is not just about who patrols, it's about who's protected." And the room held its breath, because the debate had moved beyond policy. It had entered the realm of principle, and Mamdani's calm, his refusal to match Cuomo's interruptions, began to feel like a mirror held up to the entire political culture. And journalists in the back row began typing furiously, capturing the moment not as a soundbite, but as a shift. And Mamdani said, "I'm not here to win a debate, I'm here to widen it." And the phrase would later be quoted in editorials, in classrooms, in campaign ads. And Cuomo, now visibly unsettled, said, "You're good at sounding deep." And Mamdani replied, "Depth isn't a sound, it's a stance." And the audience murmured again, because the pattern was clear now. Interruption met with introspection, aggression met with articulation, and Mamdani's rhythm, slow, deliberate, emotionally grounded, began to dominate the room, not by force, but by frequency. And the moderator asked, "Mr. Mamdani, how do you respond to critics who say you're too idealistic?" And Mamdani said, "Idealism is the courage to imagine better, and I refuse to apologize for that." And the line became a meme, a quote, a movement, and the pattern continued, not just in the debate, but in the way people began to talk about it. And Mamdani's style, once dismissed as soft, was now being studied as strategic. And Cuomo, now quieter, said, "You're not playing the game." And Mamdani replied, "I'm changing it." And in that moment, the pattern wasn't just emerging, it was evolving, and the debate was no longer about who spoke louder, but about who listened deeper. And Mamdani, still seated, still composed, had turned interruption into illumination, and the night was only halfway through. The debate had reached its midpoint, but the emotional gravity had already shifted. And while the moderator moved to questions about economic recovery and post-pandemic resilience, the audience was no longer listening for policy. They were listening for posture, for presence, for the rhythm of respect. And Mamdani, still seated with the same quiet composure, began his response with, "Recovery is not just economic, it's emotional." And before he could continue, Cuomo interrupted again. "That's vague. What does that even mean?" And Mamdani paused, not to retreat, but to reframe, and he said, "It means we can't rebuild buildings without rebuilding trust." And the room leaned in, because the line wasn't just clever, it was calibrated, and Cuomo, sensing the shift, tried again. "You're speaking in poetry. We need policy." And Mamdani replied, "Poetry is what people remember when policy forgets them." And the audience murmured, because the exchange was no longer about facts, it was about feeling. And Mamdani continued, "Stillness is not surrender, it's resistance." And the phrase landed like a verdict, and the moderator asked, "Can you explain that?" And Mamdani said, "Stillness is the choice to respond rather than react, to reflect rather than retaliate, to listen not because you agree, but because you care." And the room held its breath, because the debate had become a meditation, and Mamdani added, "We've built a culture where interruption is mistaken for insight, where dominance is mistaken for depth, and I refuse to participate in that illusion." And Cuomo, now visibly unsettled, said, "You think you're above the fray?" And Mamdani replied, "I think the fray is a distraction." And the moderator asked, "So, what is your doctrine?" And Mamdani said, "It's simple. Speak only when silence becomes complicit." And the line would be quoted in editorials, in classrooms, in campaign ads, and the phrase "stillness doctrine" began to trend, not as a slogan, but as a signal. And Mamdani told of his mother, who once stood in front of a landlord and said, "We deserve dignity," and how that moment taught him that power is not volume, it's clarity. And he said, "Every time I speak, I carry her voice." And the audience leaned in again, because this wasn't just a candidate, it was a conduit. And Mamdani added, "We don't need louder debates, we need deeper ones." And the moderator nodded, visibly moved, and even Curtis Lewa, who had spent much of the night trying to inject humor, said, "Let him finish." And Mamdani did, not with a list of policies, but with a philosophy. "We must build a city where silence is not survival, but sanctuary." And the line became a mural in Queens, a poster in Brooklyn, a tattoo on a student's arm, and Cuomo, now quieter, said, "You're good at sounding profound." And Mamdani replied, "Profundity is not a sound, it's a stance." And the audience murmured again, because the doctrine was no longer abstract, it was embodied. And Mamdani said, "Stillness is the refusal to be rushed, the courage to be misunderstood, the discipline to wait until the room is ready." And the moderator asked, "Do you think the room is ready now?" And Mamdani said, "It's beginning to be." And the cameras zoomed, the tweets began, and the phrase "speak only when silence becomes complicit" was printed on t-shirts, quoted in sermons, and discussed in political science classes. And Mamdani, still seated, still composed, had done something rare. He had turned restraint into revolution, and the doctrine was not just his, it was ours. And the night was no longer about winning, it was about witnessing. The shift didn't happen all at once. It unfolded like a tide, slow but unstoppable, and as the moderator moved to the next segment of the debate, focused on education and equity, the energy in the room had changed, not because of a dramatic moment, but because of a cumulative one. And Mamdani, still seated with the same quiet intensity, began his response with, "Education is not just curriculum, it's context." And before he could elaborate, Cuomo interrupted again, "That's vague. Give us numbers." And Mamdani paused, not to gather facts, but to gather focus, and he said, "Numbers without narrative are noise." And the audience leaned in, because the line wasn't just clever, it was clarifying. And Cuomo, sensing the shift, tried again, "You're dodging specifics." And Mamdani replied, "I'm anchoring them." And the moderator, now visibly aware of the dynamic, said, "Let's allow Mr. Mamdani to finish." And Mamdani continued, We've built schools that teach facts but ignore feeling, that measure performance but forget purpose. And he told of a student in the Bronx who asked him, "Why do we learn about wars but not about peace?" And how that question haunted him, not because it was naive, but because it was necessary. And he said, "Education should not just prepare us for jobs, it should prepare us for justice." And the room held its breath, because the debate had moved beyond policy. It had entered the realm of principle, and Mamdani added, "We don't need more standardized tests. We need more humanized classrooms." And the line became a tweet, a poster, a campaign slogan, and Cuomo, now quieter, said, "You're good at sounding deep." And Mamdani replied, "Depth isn't a sound, it's a stance." And the moderator asked, "What would you change first?" And Mamdani said, "I'd change the question from 'what do we teach' to 'who do we silence?'" And the audience murmured again, because the shift was no longer subtle. It was seismic, and Mamdani's rhythm, slow, deliberate, emotionally grounded, began to dominate the room, not by force, but by frequency. And Curtis Sliwa, who had spent much of the night trying to inject humor, said, "Let him finish." And Mamdani did, not with a list of reforms, but with a reflection. "We must build a city where learning is not a privilege, it's a promise." And the line became a mural in Harlem, a chant at rallies, a quote in classrooms. And Cuomo, now visibly unsettled, said, "You think you're above the fray?" And Mamdani replied, "I think the fray is a distraction." And the moderator asked, "So what is your doctrine?" And Mamdani said, "It's simple. Speak only when silence becomes complicit." And the phrase stillness doctrine began to trend again, not as a slogan, but as a signal. And Mamdani told of his mother, who once stood in front of a landlord and said, "We deserve dignity," and how that moment taught him that power is not volume, it's clarity. And he said, "Every time I speak, I carry her voice." And the audience leaned in again, because this wasn't just a candidate, it was a conduit. And Mamdani added, "We don't need louder debates, we need deeper ones." And the moderator nodded, visibly moved, and the cameras zoomed, the tweets began, and the phrase "speak only when silence becomes complicit" was printed on t-shirts, quoted in sermons, and discussed in political science classes. And Mamdani, still seated, still composed, had done something rare. He had turned restraint into revolution, and the doctrine was not just his, it was ours. And the night was no longer about winning, it was about witnessing, and the shift was complete. The debate ended, but the moment didn't. It lingered like a note held too long, vibrating through the walls of the auditorium, through the minds of the viewers, through the algorithms of every platform that carried it. And while the moderator thanked the candidates and the cameras powered down, the real transmission had only just begun, because Mamdani's words, quiet, deliberate, emotionally grounded, had planted something deeper than applause. And within hours, clips of the debate flooded social media. Not the interruptions, not the jabs, but the silences, the stillness, the lines that felt like lanterns in a fog. And the phrase, "I'll speak when silence is no longer safe," became a hashtag, a headline, a heartbeat. And educators began sharing the clip in classrooms, not as a political moment, but as a case study in emotional intelligence. And media analysts dissected Mamdani's rhythm, calling it the architecture of restraint, and students wrote essays titled "The Stillness Doctrine," a new language of leadership. And campaign strategists scrambled to understand how a candidate could dominate without dominating. And Mamdani, back in his apartment, received messages from strangers, teachers, veterans, students, immigrants, saying, "You spoke for me." And he read them quietly, not with pride but with responsibility, because he knew that resonance is not a reward, it's a responsibility. And Cuomo's team released a statement acknowledging the moment, saying, "We respect all voices in the democratic process." And Mamdani replied, "Respect begins with listening." And the line became a mural in Queens, a poster in Brooklyn, a chant at rallies, and the ripple continued, because the debate was no longer confined to the stage. It had entered the bloodstream of the city, and journalists wrote think pieces titled When Stillness Speaks Louder Than Sound. And Mamdani was invited to speak at universities not about policy but about presence, and he said, "We don't need louder debates. We need deeper ones." And the phrase became a tagline, a tattoo, a truth, and even Curtis Lewa, in a later interview, said, "I didn't agree with everything, but I respected how he said it." And Mamdani replied, "Respect is the beginning of change." And the ripple widened, because the moment wasn't just about Mamdani. It was about what he represented: a refusal to perform, a commitment to participate, and in campaign circles, consultants debated whether restraint could ever be replicated, and Mamdani said, "It's not a strategy, it's a story." And he told of his mother, who once stood in front of a landlord and said, "We deserve dignity," and how that moment shaped his understanding of power, not as dominance, but as presence. And he said, "Every time I speak, I carry her voice," and the audience leaned in again, because this wasn't just a candidate, it was a conduit. And Mamdani added, "We don't win debates by silencing others. We win by refusing to be silenced." And the moderator, visibly moved, said, "Thank you." And Cuomo nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and Mamdani smiled, not as a victor, but as a witness. And in that moment, the debate became something else, something deeper, something lasting. And as the lights dimmed and the cameras powered down, the ripple remained, not in sound, but in silence. And that silence, chosen and earned, became the loudest legacy of all. The ripple had become a wave, but Mamdani didn't ride it. He redirected it, and as the days passed after the debate, the city buzzed with reactions, reflections, and reframings. And while pundits debated strategy and voters debated substance, Mamdani remained quiet, not out of passivity, but out of purpose. And when he finally spoke again, it wasn't at a rally or a press conference. It was in a handwritten letter addressed to Andrew Cuomo, delivered publicly but written personally, and it began, "We are not enemies. We are echoes of the same city." And the line landed like a bridge built in real time, and Mamdani continued, "I didn't come to the debate to win. I came to witness." And the phrase reframed the entire event, not as a contest of ideologies, but as a convergence of responsibilities. And Cuomo, upon receiving the letter, paused, then responded, "Let's talk." And the invitation was accepted, not with fanfare but with sincerity. And the two met days later in a quiet room at a community center in Queens. No cameras, no microphones, just two chairs, two voices, and the weight of what had passed between them. And Mamdani began, "I want to understand, not just your policies, but your fears." And Cuomo replied, "I want to understand your patience." And the conversation unfolded not as debate, but as dialogue. And Mamdani said, "We've been trained to argue, but not to ask." And Cuomo nodded, "I've spent years defending. Maybe it's time I start listening." And Mamdani told of his father's silence in a courtroom, of his mother's courage in a landlord's office, of the students who asked him why textbooks teach wars but not peace. And Cuomo listened, not to respond, but to absorb. And Mamdani said, "I don't expect agreement, but I do expect engagement." And Cuomo replied, "You've earned that." And the room softened, because inclusion was no longer a slogan. It was a strategy. And Mamdani added, "Your story matters too, because if we exclude it, we repeat the very mistake we're trying to correct." And Cuomo blinked, surprised. "Mine?" And Mamdani nodded. "Yes, because your convictions, your regrets, your evolution, they're part of the tapestry." And the conversation continued, winding through policy, memory, and meaning. And Mamdani said, "We must teach not just what happened, but why it was hidden." And Cuomo asked, "Where do I start?" And Mamdani handed him a list of books, articles, oral histories, and said, "Start with the ones that make you uncomfortable." And Cuomo took the list, not defensively but thoughtfully, and Mamdani added, "And when you read them, don't ask, 'Is this true?' Ask, 'Why was this ignored?'" And the question lingered, because it demanded introspection, not interrogation, and Mamdani said, "We are all witnesses, not just to history, but to each other." And the room held its breath again, not out of tension, but out of reverence. And as the meeting drew to a close, Mamdani stood, gathered his notes, and said, "Thank you for listening, not to me, but to the silence between my words." And Cuomo stood too, and said, "I'll read them." And Mamdani replied, "Then we've already begun." And in that moment, the invitation was not just accepted, it was activated, and history, for once, was not just spoken, it was shared, and the city, watching from afar, felt something rare. The possibility that politics could be not just a battleground, but a classroom, and Mamdani's gesture, simple, sincere, strategic, became a model for what leadership could look like when ego yields to empathy, and the invitation echoed, not as a headline but as a heartbeat, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was open. The debate was over, the cameras were off, and the stage had been cleared, but the echo remained, not in sound, but in silence, and as the city returned to its rhythm, something had shifted, not visibly, not loudly, but undeniably, and Mamdani's words, calm, deliberate, emotionally grounded, began to ripple outward, not as slogans, but as seeds, and in classrooms, teachers paused their lesson plans to ask, "What does it mean to speak only when silence becomes complicit?" And students wrote essays titled "The Ethics of Stillness," and in campaign offices, strategists debated whether restraint could ever be replicated, and Mamdani said, "It's not a tactic, it's a temperament." And the phrase became a mantra for those who believed that leadership is not about domination, it's about dignity. And in media studios, anchors replayed the clip, not for ratings, but for reflection, and in homes, families discussed the debate not as entertainment, but as education, and Mamdani's line, "We don't win debates by silencing others. We win by refusing to be silenced," was quoted in sermons, in speeches, in graduation ceremonies, and Cuomo, weeks later, introduced a bill to expand historical literacy programs, citing the debate as his turning point. And while critics debated his motives, Mamdani said, "Intentions evolve, impact endures." And the phrase was etched into a mural at a university library, beneath a painting of a cracked mirror still reflecting, and Mamdani's journal, his father's legacy, was digitized and archived, and students annotated its margins with questions, with tears, with hope, and the debate became more than a moment. It became a movement, not loud, not viral in the traditional sense, but persistent, like a heartbeat beneath the noise. And in a podcast interview, Mamdani was asked, "What do you want people to remember?" And he replied, "That truth is not what we say, it's what we're willing to hear." And the host paused, then said, "That's beautiful." And Mamdani smiled. "It's necessary." And in that final echo, the story found its shape, not as a victory, not as a confrontation, but as a reminder that politics is not just performance, it's presence. And when we choose to listen, to reflect, to respond with clarity instead of clamor, we don't just change the debate, we change the culture. And Mamdani's legacy, quiet, steady, profound, became a blueprint for a new kind of leadership, one rooted not in rhetoric but in resonance. And the city, still buzzing with headlines and hashtags, carried the echo forward, and Mamdani, walking through a park days later, was stopped by a teenager who said, "You made me believe silence could be powerful." And Mamdani replied, "It always was. We just forgot." And the teenager nodded and walked away, and Mamdani stood there, not as a candidate, not as a symbol, but as a citizen, and in that moment, the legacy was clear. Listening is not passive, it's political, and silence, when chosen with courage, becomes the loudest truth of all.